Hey everyone, John Chappell. This is a brand new topic. First time I've used this in this class, and it grew out of research I'm doing that I hope will be a book about the top 40 and its relationship and impact on American society and culture in the 1970s. One of the groups I've researched is a band I'm guessing most of you haven't heard of, Fanny. And they're extremely important because they're the first all-women rock band to release an album on a major label in 1970. Now, of course, in pop music, there had been all-female vocal groups for quite some time. But this is really the first all-women's band with playing all their own instruments. And I think the story of Fanny and what happens with them reflects things that you've read about in Eric Foner's book and that I talked about in the PowerPoint I did on women and feminism, women's movement of the 1970s. So what I'm going to try to do is connect what happens with Fanny to those broader themes. So let's go ahead and get started. These are the bands, just a few of the ones influenced by Fanny. These are all groups that Fanny paves the way for other all-women rock bands. The Runaways, who appear later in the 70s after Fanny, and the Runaways become the launch pad for successful solo careers of two of its members, Joan Jett and Lita Ford. The Go-Go's, very popular in the 1980s, played their own instruments too. Belinda Carlisle, the lead singer, launched a successful solo career. And another group, just an example, Sleater-Kinney, hard rock all-women's band from the 1990s. All the Riot Girl bands of the 90s, all these groups owe a debt to Fanny for paving the way for them earlier in the 70s. So Fanny was unique in being the first all-women rock band, and they were unique too because of their multiculturalism. The leaders of the band were two Filipino-American sisters, June Millington and Jean Millington. June Millington played bass, June Millington played guitar, Jean Millington played bass. You see drummer Alice DeBurr, keyboardist Nikki Barclay. But this is another thing that made them unique. The Millington sisters, their father was American, a career Navy guy, their mother Filipino. They grew up in the Philippines, moved to California when they were teenagers, and became involved in the local music scene where they were growing up in North Central California. Here's Fanny in Rehearsal in 1970, the year they released their debut album. I love this quotation from June Millington, who wrote later, "We had to prove we could play like guys, and we couldn't use a can opener to sway public opinion. We needed a buzzsaw." Sexism, preconceived notions about women, those were things that they ran into constantly. So from 1970 to 1973, the band released 4 albums. You see their debut album, Fanny, from 1970. Again, this is the first album released by an all-women rock band on a major label. Charity Ball, 1971. The title track for that became their first single, and you're going to watch a video clip of them performing that on the popular Sonny and Cher show in 1971. And you see their album Fanny Hill from 72. Mother's Pride from 1973 would be the last album to include June Millington. She's going to leave the band shortly after that. Her decision was based partly on just total frustration with battling sexism in the music industry. You see them in the studio here with Todd Rundgren. Todd Rundgren was a successful singer-songwriter himself in the 1970s who started moving more into production. This was the first time they had worked with him. They had a different producer they worked with on their first 3 albums. And June Millington, in her memoir, Land of a Thousand Bridges, wrote later about this. She said, at our first meeting, Todd Rundgren says, "Okay, you're the artist and I'm the producer, right? And I'm the producer because I know more than you. That means you have to do what I tell you. And she said, and the thing is, we all stared down at him, uttering not a word. I think at that moment we were beaten. That was the end. June Millington leaves the band in the aftermath of that album. The group recorded one more record. They hired a woman, Patti Quatro, who was not a musician. She was a singer, to replace June Millington. She never really quite gelled with the rest of the band. But their biggest hit, ironically, came from this album, the song Butter Boy, which was a song June Millington wrote about her brief fling with David Bowie. And it became a top 40 hit, but they had already broken up at the time it was on the charts. So why didn't Fanny become more successful? Why aren't they better remembered, better known? In some ways, when you look at the cultural context in which they emerge, you think it'd be the perfect time for an all-women rock band to have great success. You know, from reading Eric Foner, what I talked about in the PowerPoint I did on feminism and the women's movement in the 70s, this is a time when just the term, even women's liberation, have become widely known. Women have formed advocacy groups. They seem to be making progress. Equal rights amendment was under discussion and being considered. And in popular culture, you saw this reflected in even advertising, like this example, Virginia Slim Cigarettes, which sponsored the women's professional tennis tour and marketed exclusively to women under the slogan, "You've come a long way, baby." And you see in the text of this advertisement, "We make Virginia Slims especially for women because they are biologically superior to men." Well, part of the answer for why success eluded Fanny, some of it's probably musical. Stylistically, they were extremely diverse. They didn't have a single signature sound. They did songs that were straight up rockers. They did more pop-friendly songs. I think a lot of their material was very influential on Fleetwood Mac, which came after them and became one of the most successful bands of the 70s, but there are some early Fleetwood Mac songs very much resemble what Fanny was doing on some of their more pop-friendly songs. Three of the members traded lead vocals. June Millington, Gene Millington, Nicky Barclay, the keyboard player, all sang lead on different songs, and so they didn't have an instantly recognizable voice for the band. I haven't, as I note here, discovered any evidence of overt racism in any of the reviews of Fanny, but I've wondered if their ethnic diversity may have been an obstacle, because when you look at the all-women bands that came after them, they're all white. The biggest reason for Fanny not having greater success, and the biggest obstacle they face, is the one I referenced earlier, was just sexism, which was still very much a part of mainstream American popular culture. And these are some examples. I showed you the Virginia Slims advertisement, which had a more progressive view of women. These are examples of three advertisements with blatant sexism, and the one in the lower right hand, disturbing sexism even. And this is still very much a part of American popular culture at the time that Fanny is first on the scene, even into the mid-70s when they break up. Male rock critics and rock critics in the 70s were almost exclusively men, usually focused on the physical appearance of the members of Fanny, and even at times projected various sexual fantasies about them into the reviews they did of their concerts and albums. This is just one example. I could give you dozens and dozens of others that we don't have time for. This is one I took from Cream magazine in 1972. If you've never heard of Cream, it was one of the leading music magazines of the 70s. It was the main competitor and rival to Rolling Stone. This is a review of a concert that Fanny did, and if you look through the quotations here, you'll see what I'm talking about. Describing Alice DeBoer, the drummer, her formidable biceps and wide smile. Jean Millington, slender, dark, wide-eyed, and silky. Her sister June, darker, leaner, sharper, leaves the ass shaking to Jean. And then look at what's written about Nikki Barclay, the keyboardist, describing her as hunched behind her keyboards, plump and quizzical, with cropped auburn hair, resembling nothing so much as the nice girl that your mother wanted you to take out, but who rolls an expert joint as soon as you get her home and then balls you while you're recovering from the shock. This is printed in Cream magazine in 1972. I said this is a mainstream music magazine, the main competitor to Rolling Stone, but this is very typical of what you saw in reviews of their concerts and albums. And of course, we've seen, we mentioned this previously, that judging women based on their physical appearance remained very common in the mainstream media. These are illustrations I used to reinforce that point in the PowerPoint that I did about the women's movement in the 70s, with the contrast between how two leading magazines, Newsweek and Time, covered Gloria Steinem and Kate Millett, both leaders in the women's movement, but Gloria Steinem receiving more favorable treatment because she was deemed physically attractive. I think this quotation by David Bowie, this was an interview he did with Rolling Stone in 1999, captures a lot about Fanny's importance. You can read that when he talks about them being one of the most important female bands of rock, buried without a trace, says they were extraordinary, played incredibly, they were just colossal and wonderful. Nobody's ever mentioned them. He said they're as important as anybody who's ever been, ever. It just wasn't their time. June Millington's book, Land of a Thousand Bridges, sums it up well, too. They had a lot of fun. They worked hard. They ignored all the sexist slurs that were commonly accepted in their day. They studiously ignored the racism that informed the way most people initially dismissed them, and they sang and played their asses off whenever and wherever they could. So I think the story of Fanny, I want to just wrap up by reinforcing the fact that they're extraordinarily important for being the first all-women rock band in music history, releasing an album in 1970, the first all-women rock band to do so on a major label. They're hugely influential on all the bands that follow them, and they also reflect the swirling currents that were going on in American society in the 1970s. The multiculturalism that I mentioned connected with disco that not everybody was comfortable with. I think that's true with them too. And they're battling the sexism at a time when women are making progress, but still facing a tremendous amount of sexism at all levels of American society. These are the reasons I think their story is important.